there, but also in Egypt about the same time. The Ottoman Empire from Turkey had invaded and were controlling it, and they had a local habit of eating cannabis. So that was the way it was consumed in sweets, and still is to some degree. And anyway, the Ottomans saw the cannabis use as signalling out a group of people they didn't like. They were typically the poorer end, but also the bohemian end, and also the irreverent section, the people who just couldn't really be controlled. And their cannabis use was recognised as something that went along with what they didn't like about them. And so for the first offence, you had your teeth ripped out, and I think the second time you might have got executed. I think there are still prohibitionists around who would be envious of such sanctions. You know, they think it's the herb to hell. And it's interesting to point out these religious aspects to them, because often they'll try and, you know, have a crutch of some kind of religious fundamentalism and intolerance. Okay, yeah, so the Ottomans were doing that in Egypt. We jump, in terms of a behavioural thing and permission to do cannabis and things like that and use it or not. In Europe, it became fairly contained in either just the medical people, the herbalists, the witches, the people with knowledge. Most people probably wouldn't know that they were using a drug, except they were using hemp all the time. And the Culpeper Herbalist, I think is the book it's called, came out about 1700. It has a reference to cannabis in it where it says it has no need for description because it was so common. So although people weren't smoking it in the same way they were drinking, which was, you know, Europe's main drug was alcohol, and still is. And I include New Zealand, you know, we've inherited that alcohol culture. Although people weren't doing that kind of thing with cannabis, it was in their culture. And hemp very much was. I'm sure most of you are probably aware about how dependent, say, the navies were on it. There was about 90 tonnes of hemp was required for sail and rope. And the British, the Commonwealth was you know, completely navy-based, and so this was a big issue for the British, and it was one of the reasons why Napoleon invaded Russia, was to get hold of their hemp fields, to stop them supplying the English with the fibre for their sailing boats. When the British excuse me, have we got any water at all? That's the second thing I got caught out on tonight, I think, lack of water. When they came to New Zealand, one of the things they were fascinated by and really impressed by was the flax, and that was because of the use within the Navy. So hemp and fibre and flax was an incredibly strategic resource, and that's why Napoleon, one of the reasons he went into Russia. Before that, he had gone into Egypt, and he had taken back from Egypt a knowledge of the use of cannabis, and this spread throughout France. And one of the pictures that we'll get to, if Abe can help.
You should use the mic.
Okay.
Just so people can hear, just clip it on.
No, that's a bit louder, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, if we go to other over there. Thanks. Okay, we'll take it to this woman. This is a face that would have been very familiar in New Zealand in the 1890s. Every household would have that picture somewhere on a bottle, and it was for Sister Aubert's herbals or rongo's. She was a French nun, and as a young girl, she grew up in a wealthy family, and she was well educated, and she decided to devote herself to a vocation of healing. And she became trained as a herbalist and she saw service, I think, in the Crimean War, and then came out to New Zealand as a 25-year-old to establish her missionary work and to also work amongst the poor, which she was successful at doing. And she ended up producing herbal remedies that were incredibly popular or in high demand. And it's known that she used cannabis in these, and it was because of her knowledge of cannabis from her French education. So that's the first known use in New Zealand, although there are others, such as the Chinese, when they came to New Zealand, they used cannabis in the various ways. Probably the Indians, when they were here fairly early on, they knew about it and brought it with them. And the ships that were sailing in the world, you know, from 400 years ago were very multinational. They had many nationalities on them. So, for example, New Zealand had contact with Indians from very early stages of European contact. So you had many cultures bringing their habits, and, you know, if you can see how tobacco had moved around, there's no reason why cannabis wasn't there in its own sort of way. Now, around the 1890s, there was a move to, what would you call it, regulate patent medicines. There was no sort of, the legislation and controls of patent medicines or any kind of remedies were very loose, and so you had all kinds of problems that went with that. Most recipes had large amounts of alcohol in them and opium, plus maybe some cannabis and ether, and there was one thing called chlorodyne that combined all four. And there was a murder case in New Zealand, in Dunedin, that was related to that about 100 years ago, where the husband had killed his wife and she was a chlorodyne addict. She had something like, I think, 100 or something more bottles in her bedroom. So there was a move to regulate drugs and substances, and really it's from that, coupled with a moralism, that you'll end up with the banning of cannabis. It started in different places in the world. You know, you can look in the United States, about 1915, there was a state that banned it. There was, going back, you can see Dutch Reformed missionaries in South Africa talking about how cannabis was linked to everything pagan about the natives in the 1850s, saying that sort of stuff. Worldwide, through the League of Nations, which, interestingly, the United States wasn't part of, but they were always part of the drug regulating part. They were always there pushing it right from the start. There was the United States. And kind of how they operate with the United Nations, really. They only use them for the bits they want. And drug control is definitely something that the United Nations has a big part of. Okay, so around the 1920s, there was something passed by the League of Nations banning opium, cocaine, and Indian hemp. And from then on, things in different places have different countries. The laws have just got stronger, basically, with several notable exceptions. In 1973, there was a committee, there was a meeting advertised for the Society for the Legalisation of Marijuana, and that was in Dunedin in 1973. Not much has happened since, except the laws got worse in 1976. And there was a marijuana political party then in the 1975, and interestingly, it upset people. It upset people in the Values Party, who were the forerunners for the Greens, because they thought that the vote for the marijuana party should go to them, and that happened later on, of course, with the Greens and the ALCP. But we can talk about that if we want to. Yeah, I mean, people in the Greens think that a cannabis vote is their vote. You know, all cannabis smokers are Greens people. Well, there's that kind of illusion amongst some of them, and unfortunately, the truth isn't that. cannabis use a pretty diverse bunch, and that's why there's never been a political constituency, if you can say that, for that kind of issue.